Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Carlos Aguilar. I'm a senior developer on the IIS product team. My team basically is the one that builds all the remote management, the UI, part of the managed configuration API, and some of the new work we're doing with FTP and some media stuff. The agenda for today, my goals are to show you how IIS 7 is by far the best web server Microsoft has released so far, especially for developers. How for the very first time, we really thought about how can we make a development experience much more interesting and from end to end. So not only extending the runtime, but also all the layers, whether it's a configuration stack, whether it's the user interface, and all of that to make it easy to do both from managed code and C++. But how many of you have had the chance to play with IIS 7, whether in Windows Vista or Longhorn Server, Windows Server 2008? So one thing that I really want to set clear is that everything that I'm going to show today, you can do it using Windows Vista. So it's been out for, over a year now. So you have it in your Windows Vista machine, and you can try everything that I'm going to show today. This is a two-part talk. Today, and that's why some of it is in text, in white text, the other thing is in black. Today, we're going to focus on the runtime and the tracing infrastructure. Okay, we're going to see how we can extend the web server and add new functionality to it. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., it's the second part of the talk, and in that part, we're going to focus on the configuration and the administration stack, how you can extend the UI, how you can extend the whole schema for the configuration of IIS. So with that, IIS 7 for us was a huge release. IIS 6 focused on all the basics. It focused on having a much more secure platform, a faster platform, better architecture in general. You know, the concept of application pools was created, a better isolation model was added. But to be honest, there wasn't a lot of new functionality for developers. There was not a new API or new ways or better ways of doing things. However, in IIS 7, we looked at that and we said, hey, we need to provide something better. And for that, we have a whole new architecture that includes both C++ extensibility. So no longer you have to do ISAPIs. Now you can build on top of this new class model, CHTTP module, which I'm not going to talk about, but it's just there in case you want to do some C++. It's much simpler to use. It basically offers the same performance, the same functionality, but in a much simpler way. But we also looked at how to integrate managed code right within the core of the server. How can we make it for ASP.NET developers and .NET developers, make them first-class citizens in the whole web server? And this is what I'm going to talk today. We also looked into, okay, it's time to actually do something about the administration stack. The previous UI, well, it was okay. It did what it needed to do, but it didn't offer a lot of value for developers. It was not easy to extend. It was only C++ the way to extend it. And so we looked at that as well, and we completely rewrote the entire administration stack for this release. But first, to understand how the new architecture works, let's talk a little bit about IIS 6 and how it worked. In the past, IIS 6 for developers and in general was just a black box, right? It was just a huge DLL that had all the functionality that IIS provided baked in. There was different authentication schemes we provided. There was a bunch of functionality. However, all the customizations you could do was in a sense, it was just a checkbox that you could say, hey, yes, I do want basic authentication, or I don't, or I do want directory browsing or default documents or whatever, but it was only a checkbox. The code was running, the code was there, and all the time it would check to see if it was enabled, to see if it should perform the logic or not. So the only extensibility point IIS offered was ISAPIs. Okay, it was a very limited model. None of our features was built as an ISAPI. So we were using an internal API that no one else could leverage, but at the same time, we were telling you, hey, this is a way you can extend the server. And no one actually in our team ad hoc in such a way. In fact, there were certain features that we shipped that you couldn't implement in ISAPIs. For IIS 7, we decided to rethink the whole strategy and say, okay, if we're going to create a new API so developers have better ways to extend the server, we better build the entire server on top of that public extensibility. Okay? So for that, what we did is we took all the code of all the features we had and we refactored them into a set of components. Okay? These components, we call them modules. The interesting thing is that code made the web server, the core of the web server, a very simple pipeline, a generic, fast, lightweight pipeline. So by a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with ASP.NET pipeline, the request processing pipeline? Cool, more than half. If you look at it, it really makes sense. It looks very similar to the ASP.NET. There's a request comes in, and then there's a bunch of events that start happening. First, you have to authenticate the request, then you have to authorize it, then you have to go through a set of different steps, and finally, someone takes the response, the request, and says, okay, here's the response, here's the content that you have to send back in the handler, and then the whole thing continues. So by doing this, it enables us, since everything has been refactored into this set of components, it's really easy for either developers or IT pros to customize it to your needs. But it's no longer a checkbox. You can choose which DLLs you want us to load, which ones you want us to run or not. The big difference now is that if there was any security bug found in some component, well, that code is not even in your machine. So you don't have to patch it, you don't have to be concerned about it. And of course, if you think about it, of course it's going to be faster because there's much less code running. It has a smaller footprint. The worker process has less memory. And so it basically allows you to customize it to your needs. So here are some examples how, in this case, you can enable basic authentication with authorization, which is a new feature in IIS 7, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. So, okay, that was IIS 7. That was the whole generic pipeline and how it works. However, wait. Apologize about it. There's one slide that is not showing. Okay, somehow it ended up in the wrong order. Okay, so now moving on to managed code. Managed code in IIS 6. IIS 6 knew nothing about ASP.NET. It was nothing but an ISAPI, okay? So as you can see, it plugged in really late in the pipeline. Of course, you can obviously see that there's a lot of duplication because by the time the request made it to ASP.NET through the ASP.NET ISAPI, in IIS, it already went through authentication, authorization, and a bunch of different steps. And that meant you needed to have two configurations, separate configurations. You needed to, say, for example, you wanted to use forms authentication. If you wanted to use forms authentication, then you needed to go to IIS and say, hey, enable anonymous authentication because ASP.NET will handle authentication. So you had to have this duplication both in the configuration and of course at runtime. And sometimes it was not easy to understand because IIS offers certain authentication schemes like basic authentication, but there's no such concept in ASP.NET. So how do they work together? Should I set Windows authentication? So it was not really clear. The other thing, there was a lot of infrastructure duplication. They had their cache, we have our cache. They have, their own concepts for extensibility, handlers, modules, all that stuff. We had our ISAPIs and all that functionality. The other thing is ASP.NET could only process ASP.NET specific requests. So if you wanted to protect your content With forms authentication, well, there was no way for you to do it other than routing the entire server request to ASP.NET pipeline by using script maps. But anyway, by default, ASP.NET would not be able to handle requests for PDF files or JPEG or any text file that is not mapped to ASP.NET. In IIS 7, we looked into that and say, hey, how can we work better? And first of all, we had to keep compatibility because it was really important to make sure that once you are moving your application from an IIS 6 server to an IIS 7, it remains working the exact same way. And for that, well, in our componentized pipeline, ASP.NET remains connecting as happy. So if you choose to use classic mode, and I show you exactly where to configure this in a second, ASP.NET remains running in the same way. There's going to be the same duplication. There's going to be the same double authentication. There's going to be the same, mappings and the same duplication of extensibility in IIS and in ASP.NET. However, we also created, this is a new integrated mode. The integrated mode means that, well, since we have a very similar pipeline, why don't we make ASP.NET modules, and in general, just .NET modules, a first-class citizen for IIS, and make them connect directly to our pipeline. So there's no longer an ASP.NET pipeline. It's only the IIS pipeline. And we are the ones who drive the process, and we are the ones who call each of the modules that need to be notified for those events. That means that suddenly ASP.NET can process every single request, whether it's a text file or a JPEG or an HTML static file. They can opt in and process the request and add value. It also means that since they are running directly into our pipeline, they have more fidelity, they have more power. An example of this. In the past, if you wanted to write a basic authentication module in ASP.NET, you couldn't because IIS already authenticated the request, so there was already an authentication token. What I'm trying to say is the authenticate request of ASP.NET happened way after the authenticate request happened in IIS. However, in the integrated pipeline, what this means is that the begin request of ASP.NET happens at the same time as the IIS begin request. This means that the begin request runs before authentication. So you can do more stuff. And I'll try to clarify that in a second. OK, so how do we extend the web server using managed code? Well, we could have gone and invented another API, another interface. But we wanted developers, existing ASP.NET developers, to leverage all the skill sets they had. And for that, we use the exact same interfaces that they use. So by a show of hands, anyone has done any HTTP modules, HTTP handlers? Cool. You guys know how to extend IIS 7. Basically, it's exact same interfaces, as I said. But the interesting thing is that as part of becoming a first-class citizen, ASP.NET gets new functionality, things you couldn't do before. An example of this is server variables. Server variables has been an API in ASP.NET that allows you to read those variables that the server has set. But you can never, ever set them, right? It was only a read-only collection. You could read the values, and that's it. Well, since now you're a first-class citizen, guess what? You can actually change them. Okay? You can inject your own server variables into the request. And what's interesting is that, say, for example, you have an old classic ASP application somewhere. Well, you can inject a server variable from managed code, then later you actually read it from a classic ASP application. So you can do that kind of things that you couldn't before. The other thing, we extended some of the events that the pipeline has. Now there's new events such as the log request. This is a pretty cool event that basically IIS fires when there's the need to log the request, just to notify that the request was completed and the status and everything. And this is exactly what we're going to show. We also extended the headers, the incoming headers. In the past, you could only read the headers that were coming from the client. Now you can actually tweak them, and you can insert your own headers and remove existing headers if you care to do that. There was a lot of people, by the way, that used to do C++ ISAPIs just to tweak with server variables and headers. No longer you need to do that. You can do that from managed code. We also added the ability to disable kernel cache and also server variables, which I already talked about. Okay, so what's a handler and what's a module? Modules are those pieces of code that provide infrastructure. Okay, typically they just provide plumbing. That's the way we call them. They run for every single request. They are notified, and you get to do something whenever any request happens. Examples of them are, an authentication scheme, whether it's basic Windows. Well, you want to authenticate all of the requests, right? So every request has to go through you. Compression, that's another example. You get to choose which ones you want to, send back. Versus a handler. A handler is a piece of code that listens for specific extensions, specific types of files, and then is the one that he's in charge to generating the response, to building whatever, whether it's running an ASP.NET page and returning the HTML, or whether it's reading, the entire file from a static file and returning it back. That would be a handler, okay? Examples of that include the ISAPI handler that listens to certain extensions, or the static handler, which is the one that basically grabs everything else and sends it back to the client. Interesting thing is, as we said, IIS7 now allows you to add both managed modules and handlers, as well as native modules and handlers. So you can do them in managed code or C++ code. By the way, if you're using ISAPIs, they still remain running. So in case you already have some investments on an ISAPI code base, it will still run, and it will run as part of our ISAPI handler. So compatibility, it's still there. But we have this alternative API for C++ developers that offers a simpler model and a better architecture. Okay. As I said, there's two big differences. There's the integrated mode and the classic mode. Integrated mode, as I said, that is the one that allows us to plug in managed modules directly within IIS. If you use integrated mode, only those modules will be executed, both managed and native, within the IIS pipeline. Versus classic mode will remain exactly the same as IIS 6. Managed modules will not be loaded, and only C++ code will be loaded. Okay, so let's take a look on first before we start with the demo. Let's take a look on how do I configure this integrated and classic mode. Okay, so I'm going to open the new IIS manager, which we will talk a lot about tomorrow, how it's all built in managed code and all that. But for now, I'm just going to show it. This is the way it looks. Everything is categorized. One of the interesting concepts is that we want this to be a platform for all the web settings, not only IIS specific. So as you will notice at the top, there's ASP.NET settings, there is IIS settings, and then some of the management specific to IIS settings. But in the future, you will see FTP server. The FTP server will appear in another category, which would be FTP, and then others as we keep developing and adding more functionality. Okay. The classic mode and integrated mode is something you configure at the application pool level, okay? I'm just going to create here a new application pool. So when I add an application pool mode, so new pool, this is basically when you get to choose which one you want to go, if you want to go with the integrated pipeline or the classic pipeline. This is very important because it also changes the way the .NET in general works. Trying to clarify this a little bit better. Applications, so what's the granularity of this? Applications and websites are assigned to application pools. Okay, you can choose and run certain applications within an application pool, which means that you can customize and create as many application pools as you need, and then choose which applications run in classic and which applications run in integrated mode. In classic mode is required for ASP.NET 1.1 applications. If you're using ASP.NET 2.0 or later, you will be able to use the integrated. So that's the one catch. Since ASP.NET 1.1 doesn't have all the infrastructure requirements we had, they can only run in classic mode. Okay. Now, let's actually, questions about that? Yes. Okay, so the question is, can you change the type of application pool after it's created, or can you only set it at creation time? You can change it at any time. But of course, you have to be careful because some applications might rely on that behavior. Specific behaviors that you will see a difference are, say you build a module in ASP.NET that is listening to the begin request, okay? Today, in today's world, IIS 6, by the time the begin request is executed, IIS already authenticated the request, which means you are running as that particular user. So you have a Windows token if you have Windows authentication by the time you're in the begin request. Now, if you're in the integrated mode, the begin request happens before authentication. So now you will be running not as a Windows account because no authentication has happened at the time. So that is the reason we need some compatibility, because certain applications were doing code in the begin request that relied on that behavior. Say, for example, on your begin request, you were logging, hey, user foo logged on to my machine. Well, now it's not going to work because user hasn't been authenticated. So basically, you'll get like no user has been logged on. And behaviors like that are the ones that will break certain applications, but they are by design because now you want them to have this additional power, okay? But again, classic mode helps you with that. So let's actually move to build a managed module and a managed handler. The scenario is this. A lot of customers have asked IIS, hey, could you do anything better with your logging? So the built-in logging of IIS is actually done by HTTPCs, and you get this text file with all the information about the log. How difficult would it be to build a module that logs everything into SQL Server instead of logging it into the file system, right? So every single request, you want to see them. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. So to make my life easier, I'm going to use Visual Studio 2005. I chose to install 2005 so that you can see that there's no requirements of anything else. Everything I'm going to show here is going to be using products that has been released over a year or more. So in this case, I'm going to open a website. In this case, I'm going to go for the full website just because it's easy. And you'll notice that I don't have anything in this website. It's exactly the built-in IIS website. So in fact, if I navigate to it and I go to localhost, I get the default homepage for IIS. As we said, to build a module, you have to create a class. So in this case, I'm going to use Visual Studio to create a SQL logging module. I get this prompt where it's telling me, hey, you're adding a class. Do you want me to add it into the app code directory? App code directory is one of those mystical, magical folders where ASP.NET will listen to any changes within those files, and if something is changed, they will compile it automatically. So no need for me to go and build a DLL and do anything with it. However, most people don't want to do that. Most people will build a DLL and deploy it into the Vim directory. It's just an option. It's really easy for demos, though. So I'll explain in a second how to do that without this app code stuff. So I'm going to clean this a little bit. And so I have here my class. As we said, a module is a class that implements the interface IHTTP module. And I'm going to use the Visual Studio feature that I use the most, which is, hey, help me implementing this thing because I don't know what it has. So I just click this, and that's it. I have a fully functional module which does nothing except complain about not being implemented, but kill that. So the interface IHTTP module, for those of you who haven't used it so far, it's very simple. It has two methods. One, which is dispose. That's the time where you should release any objects that you had so far in memory. If you want to release some native code or some COM objects or something like that, that's a good place where you can do it. And the init. The init is a place where we will call you to say, hey, we're starting this application. What events would you like to listen? So one of the things that we give you is an HTTP application which has all these different events. Actually go to its definition. So how many events can I react to? Well, basically, you can see here all the events that IIS will call you and say, hey, for example, when it's time to begin a request, we'll notify you here and say, hey, this is a new request. Then we have the authenticate request. Once a request is authenticated, the authorization phase will start, and so on and so forth. There's a bunch of events. We also provide you a pre-events and post-events. So basically, for example, there's a post-authorized. This event will happen right after the authorization phase happens. So you can react and choose which ones you want to use and extend and just implement them. So in this case, we said that we wanted to use some logging functionality. So this is brand new in IIS 7. There is an event called log request. So I'm just going to go ahead and listen to this guy and say, hey, on log request, oops, I'm going to use Visual Studio to generate it. If you press tab, by the way, it implements the skeleton for you, which is pretty useful. So here, every time there's a need to log a request, I will be notified. So it's the perfect time for me to actually log it into SQL Server. So in this case, I'm just going to, first of all, how do I get all the information? You grab the HTTP application out of the sender. Okay, so the sender is an HTTP application. And from that guy, you actually get the context. The context has everything you will need. You have pointer to the request, where you can see which URL is being requested, the physical path maybe if you care, everything you want. So in this case, I'm just going to create a helper function that is going to log the request. And rather than boring you with simple code, which is using SQL Server to insert, I'm just going to drag and drop a little snippet I have, and we'll take a look. It's pretty simple. Following best practices, I'm using SA, and a very strong password right there. And I just I'm using the new disable kernel cache because I don't want to use kernel caching. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to log the request. This is something you might choose to do or not. In this case, I create a SQL connection, quite easy. Just pass a connection string you want to use, and then standard SQL Server. Insert into my log with all these parameters, the date, the method, IP address, URL, blah, 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 blah. And finally, add all my parameters to make sure I don't get any SQL injection attack or anything like that. And I'll just extract. As I told you, you can get all the context all the information you need from the context. So whether it's the HTTP method that they're using, the user IP address, or the user agent, the browser, or the status code. This is also new, by the way. Substatus code, that was not available in ASP.NET before. Now it's available. So you can provide a better granularity of error messages or error codes. Rather than always saying 401, now you can say 401.2 or 401.1, which tells the user, oh, .1 means I'm being challenged, .2 it means it failed, kind of thing. So, okay. So with that in mind, I'm done with it. That's it. So it's 45 lines of code, and could be probably even less. How do I plug it into IIS? How do I now configure my IIS server to start logging my request to SQL Server? So you'll notice that here on my right-hand side on the Solution Explorer, there's no web config, right? There's nothing there. Just want to show you that. I'm going to go back to INET Manager. And in INET Manager, I'm going to go to a feature called modules, okay? These modules basically allow you to configure all the modules that you want to use within this site. And one of the interesting things you'll notice is that we have both native modules shown right here at the top. And if I scroll down to the bottom, you also have the managed modules. So you can actually see which ones are implemented in managed code and which ones are implemented in C++ code. So what I'm going to do now is go here and use the add managed module to add my SQL logging module. One of the interesting things I said is that IIS is really, really integrated, has integrated with ASP.NET, and our integration goes beyond the runtime. I haven't compiled anything. You notice I didn't do like build in Visual Studio or did anything. However, I added my class, and turns out the UI automatically sees that there's a SQL logging module there. What we do is we actually talk to ASP.NET build system and ask them, hey, give me all the modules that you have available. So whether you drop a binary, a DLL in your Vim directory, we'll be able to show you here in a kind of intelligence way all the modules that are available within your application. So it's super easy to configure. So in this case, I'm just going to then choose my SQL login module, and I'll put as name just SQL login module. One of the interesting things you'll see as well is that we give you the option to say, OK, do you want this to only run for .NET specific requests, or do you want this to run for everything? So it's not a requirement to listen to every single request. For performance reasons, you might not care about JPEG files or text files or PDF files, and still care about ASPX files or ASMX or any of the .NET extensions. Well, by checking this checkbox, you will only be called when there's a managed code handler processing the request. So in this case, I do want to listen to everything because we want to log all the requests. So I'm going to click OK here, and I'm going to go back to Visual Studio because I want to show you one thing. I'm going to click refresh, and boom, what happened is I have a new file in my project called web.config. Okay, and I open that, and what's really interesting now is that I want you to notice this name. This section group is actually new. This is IIS7 configuration. And we're going to talk about that. Yes?
You said that this is all compatible with .NET 2. So how can you have new config sections and new events and new properties?
Very good question. The question is, you said that this is only compatible with ASP.NET 2.0 and newer releases, but there are new events and there's new code and there's new sections defined. So the answer is, this section is IIS specific. The reason it works, it's ASP.NET will not try to read anything from this guy. It's only IIS, the one that will be reading all that. Now, we did have to modify the root web config to make sure ASP.NET did not complain about not understanding this. And you'll notice that in my root web config, there is an ignore section handler, Microsoft.NET, the version 2 of the framework config. And if I go to the root web config, there is actually, machine.config. There is a section, so we defined the system web server section in the ASP.NET configuration system. However, we told them, hey, just ignore it. This is not for you, this is for me, okay? So that way we don't break their configuration system, but we are the ones who actually read it and process everything. But what is really interesting now is that you can have ASP.NET settings and IIS settings living side by side within your web config file. And tomorrow we'll talk about how to extend this, how to manage this using command lines, scripts. I'm going to show you managed code, and I'm going to show you some cool stuff that you can do with a new configuration system, and in a way that if you have any configuration, whether you have a product or just your application, and you want to leverage our distributed inheritance and all the features that we have, such as the ability to run from a UNC share and a bunch of stuff, you can get that all for free. Question? Correct. So the question is, how do my code or my module is able to even see those events like log request and all the new events we've added? The answer is ASP.NET was actually modified. There is a new version of ASP.NET in Windows Vista and Windows Server 2008, which includes those APIs. So those APIs are indeed part of ASP.NET. And in fact, you know, a little kind of funny way to realize that, if you look at it, all the members actually have comments, right? So you see this, and if I expand that, you can see the comments that they have. But if I scroll down, turns out there's a couple that do not have comments. Those are the new APIs added. So anyway, something. Yeah, so the question is .NET 2, but it's a newer version. Yes, it is in a way kind of like a service pack kind of .NET 2. It's something specific to Windows Vista 2008. Yeah, so. Okay, so, I conveniently have this little SQL snippet here, but I still don't have my database. So how do I actually do that? So, well, turns out I have a little script here. Very simple. I don't have any database today, but this is going to create the database that I need. Basically, just create a database TechEd and single table, just one table called log with all the members that I need in there. So I'm just going to execute this guy. And to prove you that there's absolutely nothing there, select star from log. There's nothing, table is completely empty. But now I can go here, and just by refreshing this browser, everything looks the same. However, if I go back to my SQL server, it turns out my SQL logging module is already running. And as you can see, it's listening to not only managed types, but PNG files, the default document, and even the HTML. And you can see the response code, which site and process this, which application it was, and everything that you need. Okay, questions? So super easy. Again, interesting concepts here. Building it, 40 lines of code, just implement an HTTP module, things that you already know how to do, but now you're more powerful because you have new events. You will be able to do things you couldn't do before, such as building your own authentication scheme, which takes me to another interesting demo. The other day, somebody stopped by and asked me, hey, how can I do basic authentication? I want the Windows dialog to pop up and ask for credentials because I want to protect my website, which has a bunch of pictures, images, right? And I want to protect that so that rather than Windows going into basic authentication and trying to search for users in the Windows store, I want to have my own SQL Server database with users and passwords and have this application protected that way. So how difficult would that be? Well, I'll tell you what, it would be pretty difficult in C++, but let's see how many lines we can do it. So I'm just going to build something here called Basic Authentication Module. Again, simple stuff, just system web, get rid of that, clean this a little bit because we don't care. And again, I just implement HTTP module. Follow the exact same process, just do that, blah, blah. Okay, so I'm going to build a new authentication protocol, a new authentication scheme. How do I do it? Well, as you might know, HTTP is very simple. It has just one way to notify the client to reject them by using a 401, and then challenge them optionally by saying, hey, I support these authentication schemes. So how do I do that? Super simple. I just say, I care about the authenticate request because I'm going to authenticate this every single request that comes. And so in this case, I'm just going to do an authenticate request. And the problem is you also have to tell them that you support basic authentication. So for that, you need to handle the end request event. Super simple, just that. And I have those two events. Now, again, rather than bore you with simple code, I'm just going to drag and drop like 10, 30 lines of code here, and I'll show you exactly what I'm doing. On end request, whoops, the only thing I'm doing is the exact same pattern. I just grab the application, I grab the context out of the sender, and then I'm checking, hey, if the status code is a 401, meaning an unauthorized, then I need to let them know that I support basic authentication. This is the way you do it. There's the standard header that you can provide, and browsers understand that you're challenging for credentials. And you can also say, hey, I support the basic realm. Let's call this TechEd 2007. Now, on the authenticate request, when a new request comes in, you can just grab again the application. I have a little function here which extracts the user and the password from the standard header. This is an RFC that tells you how to read the user and password. And in this case, I'm just using the best authentication scheme, hard coding username equals test, password equals test. And if it is, then just create one generic identity and just set it into the HTTP context. Now, this is pretty cool. It looks like ASP.NET code, or it looks like code you could do today, but it's not going to behave the exact same way. It's way more powerful because now I'll be able to authenticate text files, PDF files, and by the way, in the log file, I'll actually get the real username that I'm getting. So I will get test in the IIS log, which is a request that everybody tells us, hey, how can I dump the forms authentication user into the log file? Well, you can't unless you build a very interesting ISAPI today. Well, this way you can do it really easily, as you can tell. Again, I'm just going to show you how to extract the authentication info. Super simple. Again, this is the standard RFC thing. It's just read the authorization header. I'm going to check that it's a basic authentication scheme. And finally, I'm just going to decode a base64 string. And so it's base64. So from base64, I get the string, decode it, find the user, find the password. Super simple. Okay, 10 lines of code. OK, I'll save this guy. But just for fun, I'm actually going to put something here, which is a nice statement in C#. Of course, this doesn't compile, right? I'm just going to go back to INET Manager. And this is just something that I find really amusing. I'm going to go here and I'm going to say, OK, I want to add a manage module. When I click that, it's like, whoa. It actually gives me the error that something is wrong with your application. And I can see that, oh, expected semicolon in line 8. Of course, if I go back, I realize that, yeah, there's something really broken here. And if I just fix it, save it, go back to INET Manager, and add the manage module again, and this was not part of the demo. It fails again, and that's because I forgot to add a using. Again, this is another feature that I love from Visual Studio. If you have like namespace amnesia, and you don't remember where types are coming from, just hover that and say, hey, include the system principal, because I forgot about it. Save that, go back to INET Manager, add manage module, and boom, it works. And it actually finds it for me, and some can just configure it here. Bad name. Managed basic. Okay. Now, I'm going to go back, and finally, I'm just going to turn off anonymous authentication because I want this to actually be challenged. So if I go back here and I refresh this guy, boom, I get prompted for this guy. Note that I'm not asking for an ASPX file. I'm not asking for managed code content. I'm asking for a PNG file. And suddenly, I get challenged with basic authentication, and the realm that I set is actually right here. And I can do, if I do anything else, it doesn't work. If I do test, it works. And I'm there. Okay? Pretty cool, isn't it? Simple to do. 40 lines, 50 lines of code, and that's it. Now, how many lines of code would I need to actually do this more realistic? Not have username equals test and password equals test. What happens if I want to store my users? Okay, here's a question. Here comes your, your manager and says, hey, I need to change this code, which is a sample that I downloaded from from IIS.net, and I want you to have and build a SQL Server database that has users, passwords, or role management, because I also want to protect with roles, and I want you to build UI for it. I want you to build a scalable mechanism, and I want it today. How many lines of code would you need to write for all that, like including the user interface, everything? Quite a few, right? Well, let's do it with no lines of code. Well, I'm just going to change a couple. I'm going to leverage ASP.NET membership. Okay, so is anyone familiar with membership? Okay, membership is just a mechanism that allows developers to build applications following a provider model. It allows them to have authentication capabilities, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. So in here, the only line that I'm going to change, I'm going to, instead of hard coding this username, I'm just going to say membership, and again, I'm going to use this system web security, dot validate user, okay? And by the way, the user is this guy, and the password is that guy. And if it's okay, if it's valid the user, then I actually want to set the principal the same way, except now here, this overload, which I pass null, which is an array of roles, I also want you to use the role manager, okay? So role manager is a very similar feature than membership that allows you to manage users and assign them roles. Like this is my administrator, this is my developer role. And so I'm just gonna do get roles for username. That's it, I'm done. That gives me user interface, gives me SQL Server, gives me everything. So how do I actually get a SQL Server database? So for that, I'm going to use a tool that comes with Microsoft Framework, .NET Framework, and it's called ASP.NET_Reg SQL. This tool allows me to build that SQL Server database. Okay, so I'm just going to configure a new instance. I'm just going to choose my local server, and I'm going to call it, TechEd 2007. Click next, next, and boom, I'm done. Let me show you what exactly it did. So if I go back to SQL Server, I can show you that there's a new database called TechEd 2007. So in fact, let me go and use this guy because it's a little bit easier to see. So if I go to my databases, this is a TechEd 2007, and it has a bunch of tables, including my membership, which, as you would expect, is just a mechanism to store users and passwords and a bunch of fancy, behavior. So right now, as you would imagine, it has no users or password. So now I have to build a UI for it, right? How do I do it? Well, turns out ASP.NET and IIS integrated pretty cool for IIS 7, and I actually have already UI for everything that I need to do. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create my new provider, point it to SQL Server, and then INET Manager will actually allow me to add users, remove users, assign them to roles, and do all this infrastructure very easily. So for that, I'm just going to go to the connection strings, and I'm going to create a new connection string. This is going to be called TechEd 2007, or just TechEd. And the server, let's do local. And the database is going to be TechEd 2007, and I'm going to use my, standard practices. Don't do that, by the way. Okay. Once I have the connection string, I go to my providers. Okay. The .NET providers allow me to specify my .NET users feature, and I'm going to add a new one. In this case, I'm telling them, hey, it's going to be a SQL Server. There's also a built-in one that goes against Active Directory, so in case you want. But I'm going to use a SQL one, and I'm going to call it TechEd. And by the way, the connection string that I want, and boom, we actually give you a nice combo box to pick from the existing ones. And I'm going to use this guy. I'm going to do the exact same thing for the roles. So for the roles, I'm going to add a new one, which is the SQL provider as well. We'll call it TechEd as well, and use the exact same connection string. Go to my same database. That's it. I'm done. Now, coming back to my site, I'm actually going to go to the .NET users. Okay? .NET users is a feature that will allow you to add those membership users. So I'm going to stop this, and I'm going to configure to use my ticket provider. And that's it. Once I'm here, I can actually add a new user. So I'm going to add myself. By the way, this is my email in case you want anything. Oh, I can help you. And favorite product. And that's it. I just created a user in my database. And to prove that, I'm going to go back to SQL Server, and I'm just going to refresh here. And boom, right there, that's my password, which you shouldn't see. And there's my email, and it supports encryption, it supports email management, it supports sending you password, all the things that you would imagine from a membership system. Finally, I said that okay, let's just do that. I'm going to go here, I'm going to refresh this guy, and now I'm prompted again. And even though I'm test, well, you don't have access. So now if I do test, of course, that doesn't work. But if I do Carlos AG, which is my database user, it fails. Because I obviously planned for this, and I forgot to go to the .NET roles. And in the .NET roles, I should set the same provider, and I should enable the feature. So sorry about that. If I go back here and refresh, everything works. Okay? So just like that, I actually have authentication against the SQL Server database over basic authentication with role management and everything. And just to prove that, I'm actually going to add a role. And this role is going to be admin. And I'm also going to add a role called users. I'm going to go back to the .NET users. I'm going to create another one. In this case, I'm just going to do, user. And it's user@ms.com. Some password. I don't care. And now, since I have enabled role management, now I actually get prompted, hey, which role does this guy belong to? So it belongs to the users. Just click OK. And by the way, this guy should belong also to the admins. Okay? That means that currently, if I close this guy and I go as user, I can still see everything. So user, everything works. However, maybe you don't want that. How do you protect that? Well, it turns out IIS has a new feature called URL authorization. And it allows you to protect content without having to create Windows accounts and without having to manage the file access. You can just come here and say, hey, by the way, I want to deny people, so I'm going to add a deny rule, that belong to the group users. So if they belong to the users group, they shouldn't be able to see the content. If I go back, launch the same thing again, go to localhost and use the same user, I'm not allowed because I'm using role management and IIS is protecting the content, even though it's a static files. Yes, question? Good question. The question is this doing all the location paths and all that stuff in web config? The answer is yes. In fact, if I go here, my web config has just changed a lot. I'm going to show you in a second. And all the things that I just did are right here. I basically added a deny rule for all the users. So I don't want people from the users group to access this application. And by the way, this is a connection string I'm using, and I added the membership provider and all the role manager provider that applies to the whole website. In fact, if I wanted to protect something else, say I do want them to be able to see, the image. By the way, these are the much more friendlier error messages from IIS. IIS 7 also worked part of the error messages, and now gives you a very detailed information on what happened. It tells you what's the module that rejected stuff, what was the notification it happened, what was the physical path that was requested. It tells you what was the login method, what was happening, what was the user, and then it gives you the most likely causes and things to try to fix the problem. So it gives you everything we can to try to help you with the problem. By the way, this only works locally. If I were to access this content remotely, It's just like the custom errors from ASP.NET. In fact, that is a feature that you can configure here and do the whole thing called error pages. So here I can edit and say, yeah, do detail error or not. So anyway, I'm way late now, so I'm going to move on. And coming back to the slides, hopefully. Okay. So we just built a manage module that allows you to do all the stuff, authenticate against SQL Server, authorize, do all that stuff. However, what happens when things go wrong? You know, things will break. How do I fix the problems? How can IIS help me diagnose all the issues that could happen in my application? Well, how many of you have used the ASP.NET tracing infrastructure? What about system.diagnostics infrastructure? You know that there's kind of like two separate stacks. There's the ASP.NET stack that allow you to say page.trace. Write something. But there's also the system diagnostics way of doing things, which is using trace sources and trace infrastructure. Anyway, all of those are things that you have today in ASP.NET. However, IIS built a new feature called fail request tracing, and I'm going to show that in a second. It's a very neat feature that allows you to troubleshoot problems with your application and with the server in general. Okay, let's actually take a look at it. I'm going to, in purpose, cause an error message here. So let's turn off. For now, I'm going to disable the authentication stuff. So for now, let's actually. That's another neat thing. You no longer need to go to the UI to either add settings or remove settings. In this case, I'm just going to remove all the membership stuff I just did. I don't want the connection strings. So I'm going to go back to where we started. So just that. And the other thing I don't want is a basic authentication model. Okay. The one thing I do want to enable is anonymous authentication. Okay, going back where our request is working, and it's still logging to SQL Server, and life should be good. Yeah, everything is up and running. Now, what happens if, let's do some error handling, because I'm an expert developer, and I'm going to do error handling the right way. The right way is try, catch, and don't do anything. That's rock solid. That's never going to break, right? So that's pretty cool. But now, here comes some other guy and say, hey, let's stop SQL Server, right? That's not going to be good. So here I go, and suddenly, somebody goes to my website and requests the page and start taking forever. Like, IIS broke. Again, those guys from IIS broke the server. The whole thing is gone. This thing is slow. What's going on? And you don't know. Like, who knows? Today, oh, now it works. But if you keep refreshing, then again, suddenly it's going to take forever again. And it's like, what's going on? There's no way for me to know what really is happening. So IIS has this new feature called fail request tracing. In this case, I'm going to go to my site. And again, without having to touch the code or anything, I'm just going to go to the fail request tracing task. Again, this is at the site level. Come here and enable this feature. By enabling it, the only thing you're saying is, hey, start listening to see if something goes wrong. However, IIS doesn't know what wrong means. We don't know if it's, if it's a 200, is that good, is that bad? What happens if it's a 401? Is that good or is that bad? We don't really know. So we need you to tell us what do you think is good and what do you think is bad. So for that, you go to fail request tracing rules, and I'm going to add a new rule. In this case, do I want to listen to all the content, or ASP.NET request, or ASP, or some other extension? In this case, I'm going to choose all the content. And you could choose, well, I want you to log error messages whenever a specific status code happens. Or I can say, anything from 400 to 600, I want you to log it. But in this case, I'm actually getting 200. So I'm just going to do basically anything. So let's do 200 to 600. That's basically going to log everything. You can also tell us which information you want to see. Do you want to see information about ASP? Do you want to see information about ASP.NET, such as page tracing? Do you want to use modules tracing or their infrastructure or the application services? Do you want to listen information about authentication? So for default, I'm just going to choose everything. And it's probably the right thing to do when you don't know really what's going on. So I'm going to refresh this guy. And again, it's taking forever. I have no clue what's going on. And let's actually, in the meantime, go to where the logs are located. So all my logs are located within this folder, inetpub logs failed request log files. In here, you'll get a folder for each of the sites. In this case, my site ID number 1 matches this guy. And so one of the things now I have are XML logs in here. You can look at them using your favorite XML viewer, but it's not going to be the best experience ever because it's big and however, we also provided an XSL so that you can just launch this guy and get this view. This is a view of the log. And now I can easily see, okay, they requested this guy over port 80. It's running on this application pool. It's anonymous. It took 14 seconds to run, not the most performant application. And I can switch back and actually go to each of the different steps. In here, you get a hierarchical view on how each module was running and how things happen over the pipeline. All the information about IIS is here. Or you can also go back to these different sections if you care about performance, if you care about authentication, if you care about ASP.NET specific traces or custom modules, and I'll show you exactly how to use those. Or you can just go to the compact view, and it gives you a similar view like ASP.NET tracing that gives you absolutely everything. So if I just keep going and going and going, suddenly I'll see that the reason, everything was going really, really fast, like 0 milliseconds, all the requests, and suddenly here, it got stuck for like 10 seconds. So now you can pinpoint and say, hey, the SQL logging module is taking forever. So you better debug that and you better fix it because this is not really working correctly. But it doesn't give me much information, right? What happens if I'd like to log the information of when things go wrong? So in this case, you can use the tracing infrastructure and come here and say, okay, I want to catch the exception, but I want to trace it. I want to send it to the trace. So it's as easy as just doing my application .context.trace, and I'm going to trace .warn, since this is a bad thing, and I'm just going to log the entire exception. That's it. Now, we, by default, will not be reading all this information. You have to go and enable tracing, okay? So a couple of things you need to do. You can enable tracing entirely for ASP.NET, but an easy way is just add a defined trace. And you have also to configure the system diagnostics. By the way, the following slides will show and we'll talk exactly how to configure. This is exactly what I'm going to do. But I figure since I'm running out of time, it's probably more interesting to see it in reality. So I'm going to use the system.diagnostics. And there is a feature called shared listeners. Okay? It's built on a provider model. So you can have multiple listeners. There is a console listener. So if you want to dump everything into a console application, you can do that. There is a text file listener. So they also will save all the tracing infrastructure into this text file. But it happens to be that we build an IIS listener. And so by specifying the type system.web.iis trace listener, which lives in the system.webassembly, let me just, I'm going to get the full qualified name of the assembly, which is this guy. I'm just going to paste it here, okay? Just by adding that, I'm telling this, the system diagnostics infrastructure to say, hey, you better listen to that. And in fact, I don't think I actually need to do anything now that I think about it. I'll show you why I was doing that in a second. But I run the same request again. It's going to take forever. It's running. It's running. OK, there you go. We get that again. And I have more logs to look at. So I'm going to look at this guy. And I don't. OK, never mind. Let's continue with the configuration. So now you can actually go ahead and say, hey, ASP.NET, please enable your trace. And that should be enough. But to make our life faster, rather to having to wait for like 10 seconds, I'm actually going to net start SQL Server. And I'm just going to throw an exception directly here. Yeah, that's it. OK, so let's refresh that. That should be much faster now. And now I actually have those warnings right here. And it tells me the exact call stack that happened. So we give you a summary view where we show you everything. But you can also go to the compact view and get the information within the context of the request. So if I keep scrolling, 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 suddenly I see this warning. And this is exactly what I just logged. So you can put and add any information you want into the trace infrastructure. And if you enable fail request tracing, you will be able to diagnose it. Finally, for those of you using system.diagnostics tracing, so this is using the ASP.NET tracing. You can also do system.diagnostics.trace.warn, or write, let's do write, or let's do trace event, trace error, that. So that's kind of the same thing, except it's using the system diagnostics infrastructure. But in this case, you do need to add the configuration that I was working here. So suddenly, sorry about that, I jumped before to this configuration. This configuration is only needed when you're using system.diagnostics. And so here, I'm going to say, hey, for the tracing infrastructure, I want you to, for these listeners, to use the IIS listener class that I just defined before. Okay? Just by doing that, now if I refresh my application, and I'll go back to my logs, there is an error, and it's coming from my custom error. And right now it says the same, but it's cool because you can go to the request details and see the ASP.NET specific request or traces and the custom module tracers. So in this case, I'm using system diagnostics. Those will appear within the custom module. The ASP.NET ones will appear within ASP.NET page traces. What is also really cool is if I went ahead and created a typical default .aspx, so just any ASPX page, and I'm not going to do anything except just have trace equals true. Here, just by doing that, if I request my page, you get the tracing because I enabled it, but you also get it within our IIS infrastructure here. So if I go here, I also get to see in the request details all the trace information that ASP.NET logged. So they have the begin pre-init, end pre-init, and all the events that ASP.NET logged. So basically, you get an integrated view of both tracing, whether you're building a component which is in a DLL, that's when you would have to use system diagnostics, or you're building a page running within ASP.NET, and that's when you can actually use system, all the ASP.NET tracing. So there's the two APIs, and that's the reason. Because when you have your own component, your own class, you have to go through system diagnostics. Okay, sorry that I had to do it so fast, but I was running out of time. So these slides show you exactly what I talked about. When you're going to use system diagnostics, you have to add a shared listener, okay? Again, this is built on a provider model. So if you want to use your own listener, you can build and extend it, and then you will be listening to tracing. Finally, add it to the custom sources if you're building a custom source, or add it to the trace the way I did it if you're using the built-in trace. This one is showing how to use the code using the trace source and basically how the configuration looks like. And I'll show you that in a second. So we saw exactly how to add tracing to a module a second before. Finally, how to set tracing in a page. Just trace equals true. That will get you everything inside there, provided you're using the page area within the ASP.NET provider. And I'm going to show you that in a second. OK, let's switch back a second so that I show you exactly the configuration. All the things that I've been doing within the UI, such as enabling fail request tracing and all that stuff, it's actually in your web config. So in this case, when I want and enable fail request tracing, and I added my 200 to 600, it's actually right here. And I configured to listen to all the providers. And as the slide mentioned, there's an ASP.NET provider. And if I were to remove this page, then I wouldn't get all the page traces. If I were to remove this module, then I wouldn't get all the module traces. So make sure you have the right, providers and the right settings. Best thing to do, at least when you're developing stuff, is just add all of them. And then you see too much information, but it's sometimes better than missing something. OK. Questions about that? OK. So what we just saw is how you can extend the runtime using managed code to add or replace existing functionality. That is another very cool feature. You can replace any of the IIS built-in infrastructure with your own code and make it behave in ways you couldn't do before. For example, the basic authentication. Well, IIS comes with a basic authentication, but it goes to it goes directly against Windows. Well, in this case, we just replaced that feature and added the ability to go against SQL Server. We see how you can actually have modules that handle every single request, and that handlers will allow you to respond to specific requests. Finally, you can develop all of the things that I just showed with Windows Vista today and deploy with Windows Server 2008. It should say release candidate, but anyway. So with that, that's all I have. Questions? So the question is, if we develop with Vista, do we need to wait for Service Pack 1? The answer is no. In fact, I use Windows Vista RTM, the one that you get out of the box. So there are certain things that will be added with Service Pack 1, but everything, all the APIs, everything that I showed today is available in Windows Vista and works exactly the same way. So yes, indeed, you can do everything in Windows Vista. Yes? Can you have? OK. So the question is, can you have modules or code that happens after a request? Using managed code, no. Using managed code, you can only have modules that listen to specific events that go from begin request to end request. Options could be that you grab some sort of callback mechanism, some sort of timer or threading or something that allows you to, after the request is gone, keep running certain code. But no, out of the box, IIS doesn't have anything that will call you outside the context of a request. Using native code, there are a few global modules, a few global events you can react that are not specific to our request, such as when configuration was changed, when an application was started, when I'm going to shut down myself. Those kind of events, you can do it, but you can do it from native code only. Those are the only differences between native code and managed modules. That is something I didn't mention. Managed modules are just as powerful as native code modules, except for certain events that are only available in native code. But there are very few cases where you will need to do that. Yes? So the question is, do I need to have classic pipeline to be able to debug? The answer is no. You can debug integrated pipeline and everything. Everything should just work. Except there was an issue with with Visual Studio 2005, which was addressed with an update that you can download, and will let you do that. The other option, as you can, easily show here. So, for example, what happens if I want to debug this? I can put a breakpoint, and I'll start this. It tells me that I need to modify my web config, and it complains about Windows authentication. So that's the specific fix that you need to download. However, if I go ahead and go to INET Manager and enable Windows authentication, it will actually work. So if I press F5, there you go. So I have my breakpoint. I'm able to debug everything, and I'm running in the integrated pipeline. Everything is, just as you would expect. I can see the context, and from the context, I can see the request, and the request is actually against slash. So yes, you can debug everything today. Again, I chose to use Visual Studio 2005 for that reason, because I want to show that there's no need for wait, for anything. Yes. Okay.
I will register module both in the system .web, system.web server for backwards compatibility with IIS, just to make my application universal.
Mm-hmm.
How it will behave, how the conflict will be solved.
Okay, that is an excellent question. So one of the things that I failed to mention clearly is that if you look at it here, I'm adding my module in the system.web server specific modules. However, for all that matters, there are certain modules that can run in both integrated mode and classic mode. And this is the way your old applications will behave. So if I wanted to have that behavior, what really happens, okay, I'll just remove all that. So the way your applications will be migrated is there will be a system web, and within the system web, which is the ASP.NET settings, there is an HTTP module section. And in here, you'll see all the ASP.NET modules. So indeed, this is perfectly fine. If it was running in classic mode, it would use these HTTP modules. If it was running in integrated, which is the case, it will use the other one, the system.web server modules. However,
integrated mode, the system.web settings are ignored.
Correct. Integrated mode will never, ever look at system.web.
Even considering things like membership, role manager, in fact, a lot of settings from system that is duplicated.
Actually, the only two things that are really duplicated are the handlers and the modules. And that is because we specifically needed to have, IIS was going to have those settings, but like membership and everything that I configured here is actually part of system.web. So it's not IIS reading those settings, it's actually the ASP.NET infrastructure. However, there is one catch that I have to specify here. If there is modules both in the HTTP modules and the system.web server modules, we in purpose throw this exception, okay? Because we realize that it's potentially insecure. What happens if you have, say for example, you modify your application to run in classic mode, right? Sorry, take that back. What happens if you configure your application to run in integrated mode? That means your system.web HTTP modules will not be executed. So that is very, very, or could be very, very, risky, because if there's any security work you're doing in your modules, it will not be called. So in purpose, we do that. But for that, we actually tell you that we do that just to warn you, hey, this could be insecure if you don't know what you're doing. If you are not sure that you have the same configuration. So here, for example, it says, hey, this application defines configuration in system web HTTP module section, but it's running in the integrated pipeline, so that it shouldn't be correct. However, we do allow you to bypass that. So if you're sure you know what you're doing, which it's probably easy to do. You can do validation, and it's, woo. Okay, I don't remember the setting. So I'm going to use a schema from IIS, which we'll talk about it tomorrow if you want to come, and how you can look at our configuration. Okay, so this is a long thing that I need to set. So I have to say validate configuration equals false. That way, even if I do indeed have all that stuff, my module will still run without any trouble. So you have to have that setting. You have to have it in both places, the HTTP modules and the modules, and that way your application runs either in classic or in integrated without any problems. But you kind of have to have duplicate configuration for that. Yes. Questions? Okay, just some housekeeping to do. IIS.net, it's a website that is run by the product team, so it's our stuff. We spend tons of time there. Any questions you have, make sure to post it. We have a forum section, and the product team continually looks into it. So we spend a good time in there. We publish articles, we publish samples. There's a bunch of information about IIS 7 that you can look there, and then make sure to complete the evaluations. And tomorrow there's part 2, where we will talk about how to extend configuration, how to not have that connection string that I hard-coded in code, how to move it into configuration that I can read from my applications, how to use command lines to manage all that. So feel free to attend. It's going to be at 9 a.m., same room in here. Cool. With that, thank you.